Nebraska's driver licensing apparatus has become a critical node in the broader machinery that transforms foreign nationals into state-recognized residents with immediate mobility and identification privileges. Federal parole programs, asylum pipelines, and visa categories supply the foundational documents that the Nebraska Department of Motor Vehicles accepts as proof of lawful presence. Once verified through the systematic alien verification for entitlement system, these individuals, many of whom arrived under humanitarian parole initiatives, receive driver's licenses and state identification cards that mirror those issued to citizens in appearance and most practical functions. The state imposes no additional citizenship requirement beyond the federal paperwork, creating a streamlined pathway from border release to Nebraska roadways. The core contention is straightforward. A system designed to regulate vehicular operation has been repurposed into an integration tool for large cohorts of non-citizens, including hundreds of thousands of parolees processed during the 2021 to 2025 border surge. While citizens undergo identical testing and documentation protocols, the practical effect is asymmetrical. Citizens possess the full spectrum of rights attached to their credentials: voting, firearm ownership, and unrestricted public benefits, whereas non-citizens are barred from those domains by federal statute. Yet the physical credential itself grants the most visible privilege: legal presence behind the wheel in a rural state where driving is indispensable. This asymmetry generates multiple pressure points. First, the sheer volume of parolees and other lawful non-citizens strains verification capacity and invites fraud at every layer: sponsor deception, document forgery, identity theft, and layered NGO funding schemes. Second, the motor-voter linkage embeds voter registration opportunities within the same transaction that delivers driving privileges, relying on self-attestation of citizenship that is rarely audited. Third, the absence of any visible marker distinguishing citizen from non-citizen credentials on the card itself obscures the underlying status disparity from law enforcement, employers, and election officials. The Nebraska framework exemplifies a national pattern in which states that demand lawful presence for credentials nonetheless become distribution points for identification that facilitates integration, legal or fraudulent, into American life. The result is a credentialing regime that prioritizes administrative efficiency and humanitarian accommodation over rigorous exclusion of those who remain aliens under federal law. The following sections examine the mechanics of this process, the privileges conferred, the fraud vectors that exploit it, and the broader implications for state sovereignty and public safety. Part 1. Federal paperwork as the sole gateway. The entire edifice rests on federal documentation. Nebraska accepts Forms I-94, I-766, I-797, and related instruments as conclusive evidence of lawful presence. These documents originate from Customs and Border Protection encounters, USCIS asylum offices, or consular visa processes. A parolee processed at the southwest border receives an electronic I-94 tied to biometric enrollment, fingerprints, facial recognition, and database checks against terrorist watch lists and criminal records. The parole itself is a discretionary act under INA Section 212d-5, often granted en masse under categorical programs such as CHNV or CBP-1 appointments. Once paroled, the individual possesses a federally recognized alien registration number and a temporary lawful presence stamp. Nebraska requires nothing more. The Department of Motor Vehicles submits the A number to SAVE, receives confirmation, and proceeds to testing and issuance. No Nebraska-specific background check occurs. No state-level interview probes the underlying parole circumstances. The federal government has already performed the vetting, or in cases of mass categorical parole, waived rigorous vetting, and Nebraska defers entirely. This deference creates the first critical vulnerability. Sponsor fraud in the I-134A process, documented in internal USCIS reviews, allows individuals with criminal ties to enter under false financial support declarations. Biometric matches may flag some threats, but the volume of entries during 2021 to 2024 overwhelmed recurrence screening, permitting duplicates and imposters to receive legitimate A numbers. Once an authentic federal document exists, Nebraska's hands are tied. SAVE returns a positive response, and the credential issues. The same pipeline serves asylum seekers who pass credible fear interviews and refugees resettled through the reception and placement program. Each category generates federally recognized documentation that Nebraska treats as equivalent for licensing purposes. The state thus becomes a passive recipient of federal immigration outcomes, transforming administrative parole into concrete driving privileges without independent scrutiny. Part 2. Privileges conferred and privileges withheld. A Nebraska driver's license or state identification card issued to a parolee or other lawful non-citizen confers substantial operational privileges while withholding core citizenship rights. The card permits legal operation of motor vehicles up to 26,000 pounds, serves as primary photographic identification for banking, age-restricted purchases, and domestic air travel when Real ID compliant, and functions as List B documentation for I-9 employment verification when paired with a federal work permit. These privileges mirror those granted to citizens in daily life. A parolee can rent an apartment, open a bank account, board a domestic flight, and drive to work with the same plastic rectangle carried by native-born Nebraskans. The card's expiration aligns with the federal status end date, but renewal merely requires proof that parole or other status remains active. No additional state-level barriers exist. Citizens, by contrast, enjoy the unrestricted suite, voting in all elections, purchasing and possessing firearms without federal alien prohibition, obtaining concealed handgun permits, serving as notaries public, and accessing the full range of means-tested benefits without 5-year bars. These exclusions for non-citizens are absolute and flow from federal law rather than Nebraska statute. Yet the visible credential creates an illusion of equivalence that obscures the underlying disparity from casual observation. The asymmetry is most acute with motor voter. Every credential transaction triggers an opt-out voter registration prompt. Lawful non-citizens must attest to citizenship under penalty of perjury to register, but the attestation is self-certified. Nebraska performs no proactive citizenship audit at the point of registration. The same card that lawfully permits a parolee to drive can, through false attestation, be used to generate a voter record that persists until discovered, if ever. Thus, the credential simultaneously integrates the non-citizen into the fabric of Nebraska life while preserving formal barriers that are invisible on the card itself and increasingly porous in practice. Part 3. Fraud vectors and multi-layered exploitation schemes. Fraud permeates every stage from federal parole grant to state credential issuance and subsequent benefit claims. Sponsor fraud in the I-134A process, using deceased persons, stolen identities, or gang-affiliated supporters, has been extensively documented in USCIS internal audits and House Judiciary Committee reports. Once paroled under fraudulent sponsorship, individuals receive legitimate A numbers and I-94 forms that say verifies as authentic. Document forgery compounds the problem. Counterfeit I-766 employment authorization cards and altered I-94 arrival records circulate widely, often produced by sophisticated criminal networks charging thousands of dollars. These forgeries frequently pass initial save checks because of verification backlogs exceeding 3 million cases. Nebraska DMV, relying on federal confirmation, issues credentials that appear fully legitimate. Identity theft layers atop forgery. Parolees adopt stolen social security numbers or fabricate household compositions to access child-only TNF and SNAP benefits for U.S. citizen children, circumventing the 5-year bar on adult benefits. Emergency Medicaid exploitation, particularly labor and delivery services, costs billions annually nationwide with minimal eligibility screening under EMTLA requirements. NGO funding schemes create additional workarounds. Federal grants to resettlement agencies are subgranted to local affiliates that provide cash assistance, housing, and medical screening with little oversight. Catholic Charities, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, and similar organizations receive billions in reimbursements that effectively function as indirect welfare for populations nominally barred from direct benefits. State-funded programs in permissive jurisdictions amplify the fraud. California's Medi-Cal expansion and similar initiatives in New York and Illinois provide full-scope coverage to parolees and other lawful non-citizens, funded entirely by state taxpayers outside parole restrictions. Nebraska itself maintains limited emergency assistance programs that parolees access through layered NGO referrals. Each layer insulates the next. A fraudulently sponsored parolee receives a genuine federal document, obtains a Nebraska driver's license, uses that credential to establish residency, and then leverages child-only benefits, emergency Medicaid, and NGO cash assistance in a self-reinforcing cycle that extracts resources while evading direct detection. Part 4. Systemic Consequences and Erosion of State Authority. Nebraska's acceptance of federal parole documentation without independent scrutiny effectively cedes control over who may operate motor vehicles within its borders. The state becomes a passive extension of federal immigration enforcement outcomes, issuing credentials that confer mobility and identification to populations whose presence originates from executive discretion rather than congressional statute. The motor-voter integration compounds the problem. A credential issued to a parolee triggers the same voter registration pathway as one issued to a lifelong citizen. Self-attestation of citizenship, backed by felony perjury penalties, constitutes the sole barrier. Nebraska conducts no routine post-registration citizenship audits, relying instead on intermittent federal data matches that occur years later, if at all. Law enforcement encounters further illustrate the erosion. A traffic stop reveals a facially valid Nebraska driver's license bearing no visible indicator of non-citizen status. Officers lack practical means to distinguish a parolee exercising legitimate driving privileges from a citizen, complicating enforcement of restrictions, such as the Code 9 accompaniment requirement for non-English testers. Public safety implications extend beyond fraud. Individuals paroled under categorical programs with minimal individualized vetting, documented to include gang members and persons with criminal records, gain immediate access to Nebraska highways. The state's rural character magnifies the risk. High-speed roads, long response times, and limited public transit make driving essential, amplifying the consequences of impaired or unlicensed operation. Electoral integrity faces parallel threats. While outright non-citizen voting remains rare, the infrastructure enabling it exists. A parolee who falsely attests to citizenship at the DMV receives a voter record that persists until challenged. Discovery typically occurs only if the individual later applies for naturalization and triggers a federal match, years after potential votes have been cast. The cumulative effect is a gradual normalization of non-citizen integration through state-issued credentials that blur the distinction between citizen and alien in daily life. Nebraska exercises no discretionary authority to reject federal parole documentation, no mechanism to flag non-citizen status on the credential, and no systematic process to prevent non-citizen voter registration beyond self-certification. The state thus becomes an unwitting partner in a federal policy that prioritizes humanitarian release volume over rigorous screening and state-level control. Conclusion: Nebraska DMV grants IDs to parolees while citizens face stricter scrutiny. Nebraska's driver licensing and identification system operates as an efficient conduit transforming federal immigration outcomes into tangible state privileges. Lawful non-citizens and parolees, armed solely with federally issued documentation, secure credentials that grant driving authority, photographic identification, and a platform for further integration into American life. The state imposes no additional citizenship filter, accepting save verification as conclusive. The resulting cards, indistinguishable in daily use from those held by citizens, facilitate mobility while masking profound disparities in underlying rights. Fraud permeates this pipeline at every level. Sponsor deception, document forgery, identity theft, and layered NGO funding schemes exploit verification gaps and administrative backlogs to extract resources and embed non-citizens deeper into the fabric of the state. Motor-voter integration compounds the risk by linking driving privileges to voter registration opportunities guarded only by self-attestation. The absence of visible status markers on credentials renders enforcement of remaining restrictions, Code 9 accompaniment, firearm prohibitions, voting ineligibility, largely theoretical. The consequences extend beyond individual fraud cases. Nebraska relinquishes meaningful control over who may operate motor vehicles within its jurisdiction, delegating that authority to federal parole decisions often made under political pressure rather than statutory rigor. Public safety suffers when individuals with minimal vetting gain immediate access to high-speed roadways. Electoral integrity erodes when the same transaction that delivers driving privileges also offers a pathway, however unlawful, to the ballot box. The current framework prioritizes administrative convenience and humanitarian accommodation over the sovereign interest of Nebraska citizens in determining who shares their roads and civic space. Federal parole authority, unchecked by state-level review, effectively dictates the composition of the licensed driving population. Until Nebraska asserts independent verification standards, visible status differentiation on credentials, and proactive citizenship audits tied to motor voter, the driver's license will remain a powerful instrument for integrating non-citizens, legally and fraudulently, while citizens bear the risks and costs of that integration. Reform requires legislative action to decouple federal parole documentation from automatic credential issuance, mandate visible non-citizen markers, and sever voter registration from licensing transactions for non-permanent residents. Absent such measures, Nebraska's DMV will continue to serve as the final bureaucratic stamp converting executive immigration policy into concrete, everyday privileges that blur the line between citizen and alien on the state's highways and in its communities.